Hi, good evening, and welcome to tonight's talk from EduBridge. This is Bob Yang, and tonight I'm going to talk about two things. The first is about a few common mistakes that I see in college preparation, or things that people should do but often don't. The second topic is around the question of which has more advantages when applying for US universities. High school in US, high school in Canada, or high school in China. For those who don't know me, I graduated from MIT in 1998 with both my bachelor's and master's in computer science. Since then, and over the next 20 years, I've been interviewing students who applied to MIT. Over the course of that time, I've interviewed several hundred students and developed a very good first-hand experience with what types of students and characteristics are successful in applying to the top universities. And I want to share that experience and insight with all of you today. The first question is around common mistakes. And the most common problem that I see and encounter with students who first come work with us is a lack of a focused and consistent story across the transcript, teacher recommendations, activities, and essays. What you want to have is a few things that you go very deep in. For example, for Chinese students, a lot of the time it's math or science. So you should have activities and interests that support math and science. I often see kids write in their essays that they really like and think it's important to feed homeless people, for example. I think that's a great opinion and view for the overall world, but then the student actually has no activities related to volunteering to help the homeless or the poor. So if you were an admissions officer reading the essay, what would you think? So what should you do? Before starting your applications, you should identify 2 to 3 personal qualities that you really want to emphasize, and 2 to 4 areas of interests that you can go very deep in. From those interests and personal characteristics, your classes, your activities, and your essays should all match and talk about them. Then, in your teacher recommendations, you should ask them to talk about those points as well. And in your interview, you should reinforce those points so that every part of your application is consistent in the message that you want to say. This is how you package yourself. This is the marketing that you put around yourself. Another mistake that I commonly see is to choose a college just because it's famous, or just because a student's parents say they have to go to Harvard or Princeton. Even if that's true, you have to come up with a more compelling reason in your application and interview. I don't think very highly of students who answer when I ask them, why do you want to go to MIT? And they say, because it's a famous school, or because I think I can get a good education there. Well, I think there are hundreds of universities that you can get a good education in. What I'm interested in is why specifically you want to go to MIT and why it's different from every other university. So you have to do the research on the universities you apply to. Go to the school's website, visit and tour the school, and make sure that in your interview, you let the admissions team know that you did the research And you do that by asking meaningful questions or talking about specific areas of interest in your essays that are related to the university. And almost every university will ask you this question. For example, Stanford in their essays will say, name one thing that you are looking forward to at Stanford. Now, don't say California weather or going to a famous school or getting a good education from a great school. That's a great way to give a terrible answer. Instead, focus on something that's specific and unique to Stanford that is also related to either your personal qualities or the areas of interest that you identified as the key themes for your overall application. The next common mistake that I see is trying to do too much. Quality is always better than quantity when it comes to activities. I would rather see a focused set of activities that the student has done over many years and achieved a lot of either awards or impact. I'd rather see that than somebody who tries 10 different activities and clubs each year, and they have a list of 50 activities on their resume. They may think that's impressive, but those 50 activities, each only a year long, doesn't mean very much to me. It only shows that you're not really interested in anything except building your resume. The final common mistake that I see is around retaking the SAT to try and improve your score by 10 or 20 points. Long ago, I was completely surprised when a student asked me, should I study more and take the SAT again? I scored 1,530, but I want to get 1,550. Later on, I actually found this was pretty common among students. I think it's crazy. Scoring 1,530 versus 1,550 will not make any difference on your application. Once you're scored above 1,520 or 1,530, in most cases, there's not going to be a big benefit to a higher score. Your SAT score is already high enough that the SAT will not be the reason if you don't get into a college. The reason will be more likely something else, lack of activities or distinguishing achievements. So I'd rather see the student spend the time on other activities that strengthen their resume than waste another 3 or 4 months and retaking the SAT. Now, if you scored 1,300 or 1,400, that's a different story and my answer would be different. Now let's move on to the second question, which is it better when applying to US universities to do high school in the US, Canada, or in China? Overall, unless you can compare specific schools, there really isn't an advantage between one or the other. A lot of it depends on the student. Here's how I would think about it. Number one, the first criteria would be the resources available to the student at the school. For example, if your high school in China is affiliated with Beijing University, and it gives you an easy chance to work with the professors at Beijing University to do research there, then the school will be much better for a science student compared to the average high school in Canada or the US. So I would say go to the best high school that you can, regardless of the country. However, if you compare an average school in China or Canada to some of the top schools in the US, such as Phillips Exeter or Phillips Andover or Deerfield, or even the public schools like Thomas Jefferson, then I think you have an advantage in the US school, because the colleges in the US will be more familiar with the school, its resources, and the guidance counselors there. The second criteria in evaluating schools between US, Canada, and China is flexibility. I find that the students we work with in the US have a lot more flexibility with classes and course selection than those in China and Canada. Most of the academic limitations, like you can't take an AP until grade 11, or my school doesn't offer AMC competitions, tend to come from the Canadian schools. In the top US schools, students generally have more freedom to take the courses that they want, as long as they are academically qualified. But this is just a general statement. There will always be schools that are the exception and are different. So as I mentioned earlier, it really depends on the specific schools that you're comparing to, not just comparing the countries. The third and final criteria in thinking about where to go to high school is how strong the student is. If the student can finish in the top 10 of his or her class and get a strong recommendation from the teachers and guidance counselors, then going to a top US school does offer an advantage. Because at the top US high schools, the guidance counselors often have a relationship and a track record with the admissions committees at the top universities. So if a guidance counselor at one of these top schools says, this student, Bob Yang, is really outstanding and you should accept him, this kind of recommendation matters because they know the guidance counselor. Of course, top international schools also have these types of relationships, but there aren't that many of them, and they're not as strong. Overall, the most important thing about considering where to go to high school, though, is that you should plan on spending all 4 years in that high school if possible. It's harder, it's not impossible, but it's harder to build a great application if you switch schools in the middle of high school, because the clubs and activities will be different. You won't be able to show 4 years of participating in a particular club, for example. And in the new school, it'll be harder to obtain leadership opportunities simply because you're starting the school as a new student and everybody else has been together at least 4 years. So that concludes tonight's talk. I'm happy to answer any questions. So it looks like we have some questions from yesterday's talk, which I'm happy to answer. The first question is, in terms of universities, what's my opinion comparing a top university, which is so-so in the major, versus a regular university that's very strong in the major? And so I think that too often, parents, especially Chinese parents, myself included, have too much emphasis on the brand name of the school versus what the student can actually learn, achieve, and also how it will help the career. So I'm most familiar with computer science, so I will give an example. Carnegie Mellon is not Ivy League, it's not MIT, but it is broadly recognized in the US as one of the top computer science schools. Personally, if I had to choose between a computer science student at Yale versus a computer science student from Carnegie Mellon as a hiring manager, I would hire the Carnegie Mellon student, because Yale isn't known for computer science, and I wouldn't understand why a student would choose to major in computer science at Yale. Similarly, if you go to University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that's another great computer science school. And would rank among one of the top in the program, or in the country. But if you majored in anything else at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, it wouldn't matter as much because the school isn't well known for anything else. So two different viewpoints of the same question. And of course, it's my personal opinion. Everybody's situation is different, what they want, and what their expectations for their children are different. But as somebody who has been in the industry, computer science, this is how I would approach answering your question. The second part of the question is around explaining how I personally went from being behind to getting into Thomas Jefferson, and what made me decide to study computer science. Well, I think all of it revolves around one thing, which is I loved computers. Ever since I was 4 or 5 years old, I knew I wanted to study computer science. I had a Commodore 64, which I took apart and built computers on my own. I read about computers, I programmed even in elementary school. So I knew very clearly what I wanted to do. And so because of that, it was very easy for me to decide I really wanted to go to Thomas Jefferson because it's a school for science and technology. It had 3 classes that were even more advanced than AP computer science. It was one of 2 high schools at the time in the entire US which had a supercomputer. And so for me, it was very easy because I was interested. And I also saw that as a natural way to get to MIT. And so interestingly enough, as I gave an example earlier of MIT versus Yale for computer science, similarly, my parents really wanted me to go to Harvard because they wanted to go tell all their friends my son went to Harvard. But I had no interest at all in going to Harvard because it didn't have a very good computer science program. So we had a long argument about where to apply early. I wanted to apply early to MIT. My parents wanted me to apply early to Harvard. So needless to say, I won because I applied to MIT early and I was accepted. So that made my college applications pretty easy. But it just, in my mind, reinforces the philosophy that you have to do something you love and that there is no substitute for being really passionate about something, because that's going to be the biggest motivational factor in achieving great things. You won't do great things. You won't go the extra mile if you're doing something that you don't love or if you're doing something that you're not interested in. Okay, since there are no further questions, we will end our session for tonight. Thanks again for taking the time to join us.